So my name is Magnus. I'm obviously living in Sweden, and I work for the Swedish Society for Conservation of Nature, and I'm also very active in the Swedish Dragonfly Society. And I will talk about 4 species that are quite rare in UK, but quite common, or even very common in most of Sweden. And I will be quite brief, since I will talk about 4 species, but I will be with you the whole day, and also in the breakout rooms later if you want to discuss this further or have more questions for me. So before I start with the species, I would just like to give you a little background. The interest of dragonflies started very early by Carl von Linnaeus, but it took a very long time until it gained some really further notice from the public in general. And it's only the last 15 years or so that we actually have some real amount of data. So this means that we have difficulties in predicting long-term trends. Also, of course, the population density of Sweden means that we have most of the data from the south, and almost, I shouldn't say almost none, but much lesser amount of data from the north. And you can see this is Sweden, and down here you have all the people, and they're almost empty in the north, and it's almost the same in Finland and Norway, while Denmark is more heavily populated. I'm telling you this so you will have some background when I show you some maps later on. And just to remind you, this is Sweden, or the southern part of it. And so the southern tip of Sweden is roughly on the same latitude as Dublin. And I'm sitting right now talking with you here. I will start with Coenagrion hastulatum. And this is now I don't see my own text at the top. Well, we just have to move this panel. So this is the submitted observations in Sweden. And as you can see, a lot of observations down here and along the coast, and fewer in the inland in the north. But in this case, that's actually quite correct with actual distribution. This is a generalized distribution map of all the Nordic countries. And dark green means that it's more or less abundant, and light green means that it's slightly less common. A red dot means an isolated observation from the last 20 years. And if it looks like this or like this, it means there's no distribution of the species at all. So Coenagrion hastulatum is one of the most abundant species in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and also regionally in Denmark. We have little historical data to compare with, unfortunately. But what we can say is that the species has declined and even disappeared locally and regionally from parts of Denmark and the southernmost province of Sweden. It's difficult to actually see this on the map, but you can get a sort of might see the trend here when we go through to the other species as well. And if we look more closely to Scania, this is the southernmost province of Sweden, where I live. And Scania is very interesting in this perspective because it's sort of on the cusp between nemoral and boreal regions, and also we have more continental climate than the rest of Sweden. Also, when it comes to land use, we are much closer to Central Europe than northern Sweden. And if you just, I should say also that all these yellow dots are a submitted observation of Coenagrion hastulatum. In this case, though, this also includes non-validated observations, because spearhead bluet is considered to be such a common species that no one has really bothered to validate observations. But I would say that probably most of the observations that are in urban areas, such as these and over here, are probably not correct. And also some of the more really isolated ones in open agriculture areas are probably not correct. So if you try not to see those and look closely to the others, you will probably quite soon see that most of them, or almost all of them, are in woodlands or in forest land areas. And a typical habitat where Coenagrion hastulatum is the most abundant damselfly, at least for the first months of the season, looks like this. It's an oligotrophic habitat. There is no fish, so there is definitely no perch, and almost no other damselflies until later in the season. You can also find it in deeper, larger ponds, more eutrophic as well. Here it has to compete with a lot of other damselfly species, and the populations could still be quite large, but this kind of habitat, you will only find them in this kind of habitat if the ponds are in or adjacent to forested or woodland areas. And if you're still in that kind of area with forests, you will also find Coenagrion hastulatum in larger lakes, but it is marginalized there. You will have to really look for them to find them. So they're very small populations, and there might be some overspill from good habitats in the vicinity. But they will still be there, even in a kind of habitat like this, where there is definitely a lot of fish. And the dragonfly species Epithecus bimaculata is very common here. It's a species I don't think you have in the UK. I don't remember the English common name for it. But it's you will only find Epithecus where there are a lot of fish. So it's a very strange habitat, really, to find hastulatum in. We also have some very isolated sites for Coenagrion hastulatum. One of them looked like this 10 years ago. Definitely no fish here, by the way, either. And if we just have a look from the other direction, it looks like this, quite open, still some trees to take cover in. Now, 10 years ago, this was an excellent march. Large populations of Coenagrion hastulatum, also Coenagrion lunulatum, Irish damselfly, and scarce bluetail and others. 10 years later, the site looks like this. Usually there were always some water, but the last couple of years it has almost dried up completely. It is heavily trampled by cattle, which sort of degrades the habitat. There has been no observations of hastulatum or lunulatum since 2013. Some other species, though, they thrive, like Lestes dreas and Sympetrum flaviolum. And we have also received a newcomer in blue-eyed hawker. So the isolated sites for Coenagrion hastulatum are degrading. They are really disappearing. They're not disappearing, the habitats as such, but the populations are disappearing. And not only Coenagrion hastulatum is disappearing, but also other species. Other species, though, colonize those areas, like the blue-eyed hawker. So that was Coenagrion hastulatum. Let's go for the next one. Aeshna caerulea, another species that is rare in the UK. I think you only have it in Scotland. These are the submitted observations in Sweden. And as you can see, it's a more northern species, and almost no or very few observations in the most southern parts of Sweden. And a generalized distribution map looks like this. So you can see there's no observations in Denmark, and a lot of question marks in the south. I will return to those. This is the most abundant species in the northern parts of Scandinavia. It is impossible not to see it when you visit northern Sweden. It is even active during rainfall sometimes. So it's really, really common. You can see hundreds in feeding swarms in the right conditions. So it's really, really common in the north. Again, little historical data, but it is declining in the south. These are very isolated areas, and we don't really know what's going on here. Are there more sites for it or not? We don't know, but what we do know is that it is declining. In the north, the habitat in foothills can look like this. It is very common in a site like this, usually the most abundant, Aeshnid. There are other species as well, of course, but here it is very common. You can also find it quite common in larger and also deeper ponds or small lakes, as long as they're in the forest or adjacent to forest. You can also find them in open heathland sometimes. But at the tree line there, that's where the species really thrives. This is actually in Finland, quite close to the Swedish border, and it's just a quite small little pond, but we easily found thousands of larvae of Aeshna caerulea here. So this is really a kind of habitat where it thrives. Now the isolated populations, the relict populations in the south, that's a completely different story. Usually, or I think all of the sites, known sites, are protected in some way. And this particular site, well, up till 2016, the species was quite easy to see. You just took a walk along this boardwalk and you will probably see several males along it. And some who submitted an observation wrote that it is quite easy to see along the boardwalk where the wettest parts are found. Now this is the wettest part in 2021. We have not seen, no one has seen it since 2016 in this area, despite a lot of people looking for it, since this is the most southern known population. But it seems to be gone, and it's a shame. So we leave the Aeshna behind us and go on to the northern emerald, Somatochlora arctica. Another species that is quite rare in the UK. Now, this is the submitted observations in Sweden, and at a first glance, you might think that it's quite sparse and fragmented, but it's actually not. The red rings, it's areas where there have been monitoring of dragonflies, or areas where a lot of people that look for dragonflies are living. And as you can see, there's a lot of observations of Somatochlora arctica in those regions. So a generalized observation, a generalized map would look more like this. So this is actually a very abundant species in most of Scandinavia. But again, you can see that the distribution in the south doesn't look at all like the rest. So Somatochlora arctica is very widespread and common, but it's a species that some people struggle to find, even though it can be locally common. We have some historical data when it comes to this species, but not much. And what the data suggests is that it used to be found even in these areas. But as you can see, it's either gone or there have been no observations at all. And in Denmark, it's declining. It's very fragmented and small populations. And yeah, it's getting rarer in the south. This is a kind of habitat where you usually find Somatochlora arctica, but it's also a habitat that some people miss, because when you look at, for example, aerial photographs, it doesn't show any waters, any open water, so you might think that there's no dragonflies. But Somatochlora arctica doesn't need really open water. It just needs a high water table. So for example, when you step, this is a footstep I made, and I was guiding some people at that time, and I was just showing them that all that Somatochlora arctica needs to be ovipositing is someone stepping into the bog. And it took less than 5 minutes before a female actually arrived, started to oviposit in my footstep. So I will probably never be that lucky again, but it was a very nice moment. It can also be ovipositing in small wet areas that can be actually man-made, like this boardwalk, and people have walked a lot of times. So it's just a small, very small open water along the boardwalk. You can also find them along larger ponds or lakes if there are a lot of sphagnum on the border. But some people are afraid to walk into open bogs, wet bogs, and I don't blame them. It is a hazard. You can actually at least lose your boots when you walk there. So that might be an issue for some people, but I love bogs. This is the most beautiful habitat, I think, and I'm very lucky to have places like this quite close to my home. This is another site not far from where I live that has been a very good site for Somatochlora arctica. It is still possible to see it there, but it will probably in a very few years' time be gone from the place. And that's because, yeah, well, you can probably see there's reed coming up, there's conifers, there's more and more vegetation, and it will close up and be much drier in a quite recent future. And then it won't be suitable for Somatochlora arctica anymore. This is a site just a few kilometers from me, and it's a site that looks a lot like other moorlands. Peat have been excavated, and they have stopped excavating the peat decades ago, but still the drainage system is intact, and that might not have been a problem until now, when climate change is increasing the temperatures, which means that the mire is drying up. You can probably see that this is almost bone dry. The whole vegetation here is bone dry, and places like this are increasingly common, unfortunately. And there's some Matoclora arctica is disappearing when it looks like this. So for the last of my species, white-faced darter, this is the submitted observations in Sweden, and this is quite biased, so to speak, because it's probably at least as common in this area as it is in the south. Indication of that is this is a national park of Abisko, and there's a lot of observations there. So probably if a lot of people also would have visited these areas, there would be much more observations. So the distribution map looks more like this. But again, you can see this is the fourth species that I'm talking about, and it's a fourth species that is obviously declining in the south. And again, it's rather common or even abundant in appropriate habitats. Again, unfortunately, little historical data to compare with. But we can see that it is declining, and it has disappeared from some sites during the last decades. So let's have a closer look at Scania, like we did with the spearhead bluet. And all of these observations are validated, so they are genuine. And you can probably quite easily see that almost all of the dots are in woodland areas. There are some that are not. I will be returning to some of those. This is the southernmost southernmost site or sites with the species, and it looks like this at that site. And this is not only one of the remaining ponds, it's also, I would say, a very typical habitat, at least in the south of Sweden, for the species. And it's rather common here, but it's very isolated. Let's go back to the map. From these sites up to this one, it's 30 kilometers, and there are absolutely no suitable habitats at all in this area. So how it got there is a mystery. Obviously, it must be a good disperser. And this is something that happens sometimes. Usually single males are found at sites where the habitat doesn't look at all right. And they're usually quite short-lived, but sometimes both females and males can show up. But I have never found any proof for breeding in at those sites, but they do show up. So it means that they're good dispersers, but they can't really find the appropriate habitat, perhaps. So they try to make do with others. This is definitely not a suitable habitat for Leucorinia dubia. This is a typical habitat in the north of Sweden, or maybe, well, in the north of Sweden, where this is at the tree line, almost at the tree line. And here, Leucorinia dubia is very common, together with a few other dragonflies and very few, if any, damselflies. Further south, in forested areas or woodland areas, you will probably find it in habitats like this. This particular pond harbors a fish population. a sign of that is that Leucorrhenia caudales is quite common here, and you will usually only find larvae of that species in ponds with fish. So Leucorrhenia dubia is not very common in a site like this, but you will find it there. So I will just try to move the bar again, it's in my way, sorry. So peatlands are critical for preventing and mitigating the effects of climate change and so on. And this is from IUCN quite recently. And why am I showing this? Well, it's time we take peatland conservation and restoration seriously. There are some things happening there that are not boding well at all. There are some good things happening though, some good news. More and more people, more and more societies are taking the threat more seriously. I have noticed that BDS are doing some great stuff, and I hear that even on Gardeners World, they're talking about try to buy peat-free compost instead of the one with peat and so on. There are also some large projects. This is Life to Admire. It's a Swedish project that works with restoring, draining and overgrowing wetlands. And one easy way of doing that is, of course, just to fill in those drainage systems that keep the water away from the mires. Unfortunately, it's sad to say, but unfortunately, habitat restoration doesn't really seem to help the species. This is a graph that you might find in Worldwide Dragonfly Association's journal Coenagrion, and it shows the distribution trends for two rather common species in Europe, Leicester sponsa and Sympetrum danae. Both are associated with peatland habitats, and they are declining all over Europe, and they are not alone, unfortunately. And in the Netherlands, they have worked with habitat restoration, but the species doesn't seem to be helped by it in the long run. So, conclusions. All the four species are rather common or even abundant in the adequate habitats. But habitats in the south have been lost. We have very little historical data on dragonflies, but we have a lot on birds that occur in the same kind of habitats. And they have all declined or even disappeared on a regional or local scale. And apart from the species, the four dragonflies I have been talking about, a lot of other dragonflies associated with the same habitat are declining as well, and not only in the south of Scandinavia, but all over Europe. The reasons, there are probably reasons, a lot of reasons. Climate change is one of them, definitely, and it's difficult to do something about that. We can help in other ways, but it is difficult, to be honest. And the trend is much the same throughout Europe. Almost every county's red list contains species that colonize fens, raised bogs, and the like. And unfortunately, it seems that restoration projects doesn't help them in the long run. And that's me. That was my talk. I have no idea what time it is, but I will stop sharing now.